Welcome to Silicon Bytes episode 47. And in this edition, we're going to be looking at how the Russian economy is mobilizing for war, but not everything is going the way Putin wants it to. But before we dive into that topic, let's take an overlook at the week's news. This is from the Financial Times. We're going to quickly skip through the various headlines. Russia-China gas pipeline deal stalls over Beijing's price demands. Well, this is one of the bad news stories for Putin. We're going to dive into this in more detail because there's a whole range of stories this week about not just Russia's mobilization of its economy for war, but the shock that that is having on the economy, and in this instance, how China, its supposed ally, is trying to screw it over on gas prices. There's also a fascinating article in the Financial Times arguing about how we need to, quote, put sand in the gears of Russia's war machine. The private sector must play its part in hobbling Putin's military-industrial complex. That is a fascinating read. It is behind the paywall, just a warning there, but I will put links in the description of the video in case you do have a subscription for the Financial Times. Another story we're covering this week is the Zelenskyy Peace Summit in Switzerland and the story that China is actively trying to help Russia to sabotage that peace summit. And of course, the big news story is that Biden has allowed Ukraine to use US weapons to hit targets in Russia. We're going to be diving into that story and examining some of the first reports of those weapons being used on Russian territory. And another story about an effort to choke off supplies to Russia's war machine. This time, the article talks about how China is providing a conduit for components, materials, and supplies to supply Russia's military-industrial complex. And there are numerous stories about Russian espionage. Police have raided a European Parliament staffer's office in a Russian influence probe. This is one of many stories on this topic. Guillaume Pradara is accused of playing a significant role in a Voice of Europe scandal. And at the same time, as stories are breaking about Russian penetration of politics, media, and other institutions, Poland is moving to reinforce its borders with Belarus and Russia. Warsaw accuses Moscow of ruthless hybrid war in driving migrants over the frontier into the EU. And as many of you will have seen, permission has been given by the US for Ukraine to use Western manufactured arms to strike Russia. But France was out there in front and announced this permission several days ahead of the US announcement. Germany has reluctantly done the same, but has put restrictions on Kiev's use of these longer range munitions in that they can only be used in the Kharkiv area. We'll be diving into that in more detail and the implications of these restrictions. Talking of restrictions, Belgium has pledged 30 F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine, which is fantastic, but has then come out and said that they cannot be used to strike Russian territory. Now, this is likely to be a restriction we will see imposed by other countries supplying F-16 fighter jets. There will be a few exceptions, quite possibly the Nordics and the Baltics, but other Western European countries are likely to prevent these munitions being used directly against Russian territory, a loophole that Russia, of course, will take advantage of in order to strike Ukraine. More interesting stories in the Financial Times, including the missing Baltic boys that mark out the maritime border fault lines. Russia and China, it says, are challenging the global system of national boundaries at sea and in inland waters. Elizabeth Braw, who you will probably know has been on the channel twice now, talks in detail about how the international order is being challenged by the so-called authoritarian alliance. And it's being done in a salami slicing tactic way, in a way that will not trigger a military response, but nonetheless makes the West look weak and is constantly probing and poking in holes in our defenses and in our willingness to defend our borders and our values. Now, some positive news here on defending borders, and that's the announcement that 6 NATO countries are planning a drone war to defend the borders with Russia. Again, we look here to some of the Eastern European states, Nordics and Baltics, who are out in front in tackling Russian aggression. In this instance, the drone wall is being set up by Finland, Norway, Poland, and the 3 Baltic states, and it is intended to prevent Moscow's hybrid attacks. And The Economist also has a number of interesting stories. We'll put links to these in the description. Again, they are behind the firewall, but you are allowed to read 1-2 articles a month for free, so hopefully you will gain access to these. This is an interesting story about how many Ukrainian drones have been disabled by Russian jamming. And this is something we've talked about in many of the interviews recently, and that is the innovations in electronic warfare, the innovations in drone warfare that are moving at an incredible pace, despite the so-called stalemate on the battlefield. The evolution of warfare techniques and technology is moving apace. And this article goes into the idea that latest drone models do not require solely their electronic navigation in order to find their targets, but they are starting to use autonomous AI systems that are able to navigate by sight alone. Again, we are moving rapidly towards an AI-driven drone warfare technology that will be a signature of future warfare. And here's some other interesting, albeit not so positive stories. One is about Ukraine's desperate draft dodgers, some of whom are risking death by crossing rivers and so on to escape conscription. How extensive this is, I think, is difficult to calculate, but it is clear that some of them are risking life and limb by crossing dangerous rivers, for instance, in order to get to places where they cannot be found or even leave the country. Now, this needs to be put in context because many people are voluntarily joining the army, and many tens of thousands have already joined up to defend their country. Another interesting article here is about the flaw in the Western plan to rearm Ukraine, and that is the idea here that Europe lacks TNT and other propellants for shells and missiles. Russia, of course, is faced with similar challenges, but it does have partners in North Korea, Iran, and other authoritarian states that do seem to be ramping up their military-industrial complex in order to fuel Russia's aggression. Now let's turn to news on the front. Russian troop losses hit a record high in May, says the Kyiv Independent. Russian troop losses in May amounted to around 38,940, estimates the paper, the highest monthly figures since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. And this may well be to do with the Kharkiv offensive, which is driven more by political logic rather than any kind of sound military logic. The previous record of 29,000 was set in December of last year, when Russian forces lost huge numbers of service people during the battle for the town of Avdiivka in eastern Donetsk Oblast. The fact that Russia has lost so many may attest to the ending of the ammunition famine that has lasted for 6 months. And it suggests that Russia really has not timed their offensive well. And in fact, by opening new offensives, it has changed the dialogue in the West. It has helped to accelerate the provision of artillery from Western partners. And of course, as we'll come to later, it has driven the debate about whether Ukraine should be allowed to strike back against Russian territory. Russia, through its aggression, through its mindless invasion of Ukraine, and through opening up new front lines, has actually prompted the Allies into action and to take this seriously. It's another own goal by so-called master strategist Vladimir Putin. And we mentioned in the introduction the peace summit, which Zelenskyy is trying to organize in Switzerland. The Kyiv Independent reports that Zelensky has accused China of working hard to stop countries attending the Global Peace Summit. Speaking at the Shangri-La Dialogue Security Forum in Singapore on June the 2nd, he expressed his disappointment that some world leaders would not be present at the event to be held in Switzerland on June the 15th to the 16th. Ukraine is hoping that the summit will address several key areas, such as energy security, the exchange of captives, the return of deported children, global food security, and many other topics that are impacted by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. China, unfortunately, is working hard today to prevent countries from coming to the peace summit. And the likelihood is because they do not want the comprehensive peace that Ukraine is asking for, that Ukraine deserves. They have aligned themselves with Russia's so-called peace plan, which is nothing more than a plan to carve up Ukraine, take a breath, to pause to rearm, and then try to take the entirety of the country. There are good reasons to support Ukraine in resisting the so-called China peace plan because it is, in fact, a fig leaf for the Russia war plan. But whereas China is supporting Russia in this regard, there are good economic reasons, perhaps, why it is doing that. And here's a fascinating story in Bloomberg, UK, although this story has been covered in a number of publications. This is Putin's pipe dream exposes China's energy advantage, says the article. The Russian president ended his visit to Beijing last week without a formal deal on the power of Siberia 2. This is the gas pipeline intended to divert gas supplies away from Europe and towards its new partner, China. Vladimir Putin had hoped that his visit to China would be an opportunity for the Russian president and counterpart Xi Jinping to showcase their so-called no-limits friendship. But one thing they didn't bring up, certainly in the press release issued at the end of that summit, was the stalled talks around the 2,000-mile pipeline project. The two leaders parted without any significant deal on power of Siberia 2, a massive proposed link that would allow Russia to ship 50 billion cubic meters more gas a year, directing some of the flows it had used to export to Europe before the invasion of Ukraine. Both sides came out with the usual banalities that they remain interested and promised an agreement in the near future, etc., etc. But what is the real reason why this project has been stalled? And of course, the answer is that China is demanding a ludicrously low price for each cubic meter of that gas, far lower than some of Russia's current trade partners and far, far lower than the market rates that Europe was paying prior to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Russia has tied itself to a partner that is trying to gouge it for every single dollar. And we have to ask the question whether Russia will end up selling its gas at near cost price to its so-called ally, China. Again, this highlights the master strategy of Putin to essentially put himself at the mercy of China, which of course is a merciless negotiator in such deals. And turning back to the situation on the Kharkiv front, this article from the Kyiv Independent quotes a Ukrainian soldier as saying, "We took out so many of them. Ukraine stabilizes the Kharkiv front after Russia's brutal assault. We stopped the enemy. They are not going any further. Now we will push them back to the border." According to open source mapping, little to no further gains have been noticeable in the past week by Russian forces. On May the 24th, Ukraine's general staff announced that Ukrainian forces had already begun counterattacking operations in the area. The ease with which Russian infantry groups seemed initially across the border and to advance into Kharkiv Oblast caused a stir in Ukrainian society. It was at odds with the idea that the command had prepared for such an attack. Particular scrutiny was placed on the apparent failure of Ukrainian fortifications along the border in Kharkiv Oblast, the defenses of which have been singled out for praise by President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. There were, of course, rows of dragon teeth, there were anti-tank obstacles, and roughly dug trench systems are clearly invisible on the OSINT maps. But soldiers have been quoted as saying the situation is far more complex. We are not idiots, and they are not idiots either. There is a wide grey zone on the border where there is no real chance to dig in, explains the soldier. They entered that grey zone, and we met them. As Russia advanced slowly in the rolling fields defended by Ukrainian units, including the 42nd and Khartia, focus shifted to urban fighting in Vovchansk, a town just 5 kilometers from the border. Here, Moscow was able to concentrate its firepower, most notoriously its airdropped gliding bombs, and these were devastating in their effect. Russia has now razed almost completely the previously thriving town of Vovchansk over just a few weeks of fighting. According to some sources, Russian forces had at one point taken over 2/3 of Vovchansk's urban area, but now they've been pushed back across the Volcha River into the northern suburbs of the town. And as you can see by these images, it's a terrifying sight how Russia have turned big swathes of the town into smoke and rubble. And now we're going to go in a little more detail into the permission that Washington has given for Kiev to strike inside Russia with US arms, but only near Kharkiv. This is from the Kyiv Independent. The US gave permission to use American-supplied weapons to strike targets in Russia located near the border with the Kharkiv Oblast. This was confirmed by President Zelensky's spokesperson on the 31st of May. Washington, however, still prohibits Ukraine from using ATACMS and other long-range US-supplied weapons for strikes deeper into Russia, US officials have said. This will significantly boost Ukraine's ability to counter Russian attempts to mass cross the border. But if Russia seeks to make incursions into other territories, for instance, north of Sumy, then this permission by President Joe Biden apparently will not count. So the West is still, to an extent, putting a straitjacket on Ukraine. It is still trying to micromanage how Ukraine is fighting the war. This is a topic we're going to pick up on in many of the subsequent discussions with guests on the channel in the coming weeks. And just as the US made the announcement, it was reported that the German government was cautiously ditching its reservations about allowing Ukraine to strike military targets inside Russia with the so-called donated arms. This is, of course, a big move for the traditionally ultra-cautious German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. The idea of German-made weapons being used to strike Russian territory would have been inconceivable 2 years ago, but now there is tacit permission to do this. Again, the same restrictions, unfortunately, apply, and there is no sign that Germany will be providing Taurus missiles. And this is unfortunately important because, as the Kyiv Independent reports, Russia is still attacking on multiple fronts. Over the weekend, Russia launched a large-scale missile attack on Ukraine, severely damaging energy infrastructure. At least 20 people, including children, were injured in these attacks, which took place across various regions of the country. In Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, at least 4 people were injured in the strikes, including a 7-year-old girl. Following a strike on the city of Nikopol, Governor Serhiy Lusak reported the attack damaged a house, as well as 2 other buildings and a transport bus. In Lviv, Russian forces hit energy infrastructure facilities, injuring 4 people. And if you're following volunteers who are in Lviv, you will have known that for periods of the weekend, electricity supply was knocked out as a result. Ukraine's Energy Minister Herman Holoshenko confirmed that energy infrastructure in Zaporizhia, Dnipropetrovsk, Donetsk, Kirovohrad, and Ivano-Frankivsk oblasts came under fire by Russian forces. Restoration and emergency workers are currently on the scene and determining the extent of the damage. But once again, the caution and timidity of the West in providing air defense for Ukraine is leaving the skies open to Russian attacks. Russia has caused hundreds of millions of pounds of damage to Ukrainian energy infrastructure. And not only are we asking the question of how Ukraine can survive the loss of its energy generating capacity, we're not even asking the question about how it can be rebuilt and restored. The costs will be absolutely astronomical. Of course, there is one easier option, and that is to hand over the seized Russian central bank assets to Ukraine to help them survive, to help them push Russia out of their territories, and to rebuild. This is a step that has been endlessly delayed, but ultimately it seems that it will be an inevitable decision because the West will not foot the bill for many hundreds of billions of pounds that it will cost to rebuild the entirety of Ukraine's infrastructure. Now we turn to the story about which this episode is really focused on, and this is an important one because it shows Russia is crumbling from the inside. Now, in the last bites, we talked about the new defense minister, Belousov, who is putting Russia's economy on a war footing. We also covered the multiple arrests of individuals within the Ministry of Defense. And of course, we positioned it as more of an exercise in requisitioning as opposed to a fight against corruption. Corruption is endemic. Belousov is not going to be able to transform the system in any meaningful way, but he may be able to scrape together enough resources to keep money flowing to the military-industrial complex. And we see some of the first signs of changes in Russia's economic policies that tie in with these changes in the Ministry of Defense. Russia is preparing new tax hikes, and here is why, explains the Moscow Times. Russia's finance ministry submitted a major tax reform plan this week that seeks to introduce a progressive tax system and increase corporations' contributions to the state budget. The reform, if passed, promises to generate nearly 3 trillion rubles, that's $33 billion per year, at a time where the government spending on the war in Ukraine continues to soar. And Vladimir Putin has come out to say that the tax system needs an overhaul to make it fair, adding that corporations, legal entities, and individuals who earn more should contribute more. What this actually means is that Putin is going to start gouging business in order to pay for his pointless war. Russia's income tax system has been pegged relatively low throughout Putin's tenure. It stands at 13% for people earning less than 5 million rubles per year, that's $55,000, and 15% for those earning more, which, if you compare it to many Western European countries, is, of course, an incredibly low rate. For those earning 50 million rubles or higher, it is proposed that the tax will be hiked up to 22%. That is still advantageous when you compare it to Western tax systems, but when you combine it with the inflation on basic goods that's taking place, it means that people do, at the end of the month, have a lot less to spend, even if their pay packets look relatively healthy. The average monthly income in Russia for 2024 was 74,000 rubles, which is $830, according to the state statistics agency Rosstat. In other words, Russia's earned on average almost 900,000 rubles last year. That is $9,960. That is less. That is a lot less than the threshold for the lowest bracket in the proposed tax reforms. So how much money this actually nets the Russian exchequer is open to question. It also means that Russia's super wealthy, who make their money largely on investments, capital gains, and other forms of passive income, such as dividends and real estate, are unlikely to feel much of a direct impact. For this reason, some analysts are calling the progressive tax scheme a tax on wages rather than on income. Now, whether this is accidental or intentional, we will find out soon. If the tax doesn't net Russia's exchequer enough, then we will surely see more requisitioning taxes being imposed on other elements of the economy. Now, there's a lot more detail in this article. I recommend reading it because it doesn't create a particularly healthy picture, but it does suggest a certain level of desperation in the Russian government to haul in more cash to keep its military industrial complex afloat. On the other end of the scale, for those who are in the lower paid brackets, Russia's soaring wartime salaries are bolstering working class support for Putin and, by extension, the war, says the Moscow Times. The reasons for rising incomes in Russia have been well documented: a labor shortage, hefty payments to soldiers and their families, and an unprecedented level of state spending that has obliged the defense sector factories to work around the clock. That, of course, nets certain workers considerably more in overtime payments. However, whether standards of living have actually improved is open to debate, given the record military spending, high inflation, Western sanctions, and limits on hydrocarbon exports. The data that is available, of course, comes from the Russian Economics Ministry, and we have to question the validity of some of it, but it shows that real incomes rose 5.8% in 2023 and at the same rate in the first quarter of 2024, according to Rosstat. On top of that, figures from the Federal Tax Service showed that Russia's state income tax revenues in 2023 were 40% higher than in 2021. The 15 fastest growing regions in terms of income tax contribution, excluding the regions Russia claims it's annexed in Ukraine, include hardly any of the traditional big donors. Instead, the top spots are occupied by regions that before the war were traditionally net recipients from the federal budget. They include the Republic of Chuvashia, Bryansk region, Kostroma region, Kurgan region, Smolensk region, and Zabaikalsky region. There were only 3 regions where income tax contribution growth was under 20%. And of course, these regions may well align with areas that are contributing a lot of contract soldiers to the army and therefore receiving a lot of payments when those contract soldiers don't return from Ukraine. But how are Russians spending this additional money they seem to be earning? Well, the answer seems to be they're spending more, but they're also saving more. And with high inflation, it's potentially the case that this is not a particularly logical thing to do because inflation is likely to wipe out any gains from those savings. When it comes to consumption, the picture is extremely varied and quite complex. Consumers operate within certain limits, of course. Russians aren't allowed to go to Europe because air transport links were severed at the start of the war, and of course, it's harder to get a visa. It's also difficult to buy a new car. Not everyone wants a Chinese-made vehicle. Not everyone wants a Chinese-made vehicle. But there are some interesting trends in spending. Demand continues to grow for mortgages, and this has been accelerated by state-subsidized mortgage programs. The second trend is perhaps not so positive, and that is a booming gambling market. The income of legal bookmakers rose 40% in 2023, and active gamblers, those who bet at least once a week, numbered some 6.6 million people. This is perhaps very telling when you do not feel you have any future, and perhaps the only alternative to paying off your debts is going to serve in Ukraine. It's perhaps not surprising that out of desperation, some people turn to gambling, although that is hardly likely to solve their problems. And in fact, one could say the state almost certainly encourages that, because if people get into debt, then they are far more likely to be forced into signing a military contract, and again, going to fight, serve, and die in Putin's pointless war. We've got a few more stories to cover off. This one, I think, in Nova Gazeta is absolutely fascinating, and it is called Hypersonic Paranoia. As treason cases at the highest level of Russian science pile up, is Kremlin sanctions spy mania out of control? Asks the article. On the 21st of May, a St. Petersburg court sentenced 77-year-old scientist Anatoly Maslov to 14 years in prison for treason. A leading global specialist on hypersonic physics with an illustrious career, Maslov had already spent 2 years in an FSB isolation unit while prosecutors prepared the case against him for allegedly sharing details of Russia's hypersonic weapons program with a foreign government. Maslov has maintained that the charges against him are baseless. But the summer of 2022 saw 3 leading Russian scientists arrested, one after the other, in similar circumstances. And the sentences are getting longer. Yevgeny Smirnov, a lawyer for the First Department, a legal advocacy group that specializes in closed trials, described the sentence handed down to Maslov as part of the trend towards harsher punishments in the Russian judicial system since the war in Ukraine began. The 14 years given to Maslov was perhaps a record sentence. Another scientist, 75-year-old Viktor Kudryavtsev, was arrested for allegedly passing classified information to the Belgian von Karman Institute for Fluid Dynamics, where the Trans-Siberian project was based. And still the arrests continue. In 2023, after yet another arrest, researchers at the Institute of Theoretical and Applied Mechanics published an open letter to the Russian authorities, and in it they stressed the patriotism of the various scientists involved in these legal cases. The letter also suggests that the men had been prosecuted for sharing research with the wide international community, which they said was considered an obligatory component of conscientious and high-quality scientific activity. Well, that letter is no longer available. The signatories of it are probably frightened for their own safety. But this highlights the increasingly Stalinist turn that Russia is taking, where any contact with foreign colleagues, institutions, or governments is seen as a sign of treachery to the homeland. It means that Russian science is going to become increasingly closed off from the rest of the world community and potentially miss out on knowledge and advances that are taking place. Now, of course, that is sad for the individual scientist, but in the context of Russia being such a malignant, aggressive state, it is perhaps a good idea for Russian science and scientists who are still operating within the Russian Federation to be cut off from the international community. But what some of my speakers on the channel have recently suggested, including Garry Kasparov, and I think in this context it's a good idea, the West could seek to poach Russian engineers, specialists, and scientists. It could seek to kick off a new brain drain that sucks the technical capability out of the Russian system. That would seem to be a good strategic move at this time, especially where Russia is turning to an increasingly paranoid and irrational Stalinist approach to its own scientists and engineers. And that paranoia increases, and it's only to be expected. The Moscow Times reports that Russia has labeled the Wives of Mobilized Soldiers group a foreign agent. This happened on Friday. Moscow uses the label, which is heavy in Soviet-era connotations, on anyone it considers a critic of the Kremlin, and of course it is intended to silence any dissent. Russia's Justice Ministry included the Put Domoy, Way Home movement, which has organized women-led protests in Moscow to bring mobilized men back from Ukraine. It's added them to its list of foreign agents. The Justice Ministry said it had worked to create a negative image of Russia and the Russian army and called for illegal protests. It's also labeled one of the movement's leaders, Maria Andreeva, as a foreign agent. Now, of course, from the Ukrainian perspective, this group is trying to fight for Russian soldiers' rights. It is not calling for an end to the war. It is not labeling the war as criminal. So this group will have limited sympathy, I think, outside of Russia. If, however, it helps to undermine Putin's regime, then of course it is to be welcomed, perhaps. But Ukraine is not waiting for an internal revolution in Russia. That is hardly likely, according to many of the world's experts. Instead, Ukraine continues to strike Russian oil refinery capacity. And here are a couple of stories on that topic from the KYIV Post. Ukhtar oil refinery in Russia rocked by explosions and fire. Casualties reported. An attack by unmanned aerial vehicles is not being considered as one of the causes. However, sabotage or drones are highly likely to have caused this, as we have seen similar explosions in many other parts of Russia. In Ukhtar, in the Russian Republic of Komi, a fire broke out at a local oil refinery owned by Lukoil following a series of explosions. It was reported on Russian Telegram channels. The fire started on June the 2nd, which was a Sunday. According to eyewitnesses before the fire, they heard several explosions in the area of the oil refinery. A column of smoke was seen soon coming from that direction. Now, of course, this bears all the hallmarks of a Ukrainian attack. Whether it is on-the-ground sabotage or drones, we do not yet know. But what we do know is that SBU drones have destroyed a $100 million Russian radar system in Crimea. Sources from Ukraine's special services told the Kyiv Post about the latest successful SBU operation, which has rendered Russian air defenses in Crimea virtually blind. Ukraine's special forces report that on the night of May the 29th to the 30th, Russians lost one long-range radar detection system, Neba SVU, reported to be worth around $100 million, which was located near Armyansk and used to monitor a more than 380-kilometer section of the front protecting Russian positions in Crimea. According to the sources, the radar system was hit by 7 aircraft-type kamikaze drones in an operation run by the Counterintelligence Department of the Security Service of Ukraine, after which the satellite reconnaissance detected that emissions from the system could no longer be detected. Now, this is another crucial step in Ukraine's siege of Crimea and its attrition of Russian monitoring and offensive capability in that area. It is softening Crimea up for what is hoped to be the eventual assault to retake it. And before we finish, here is an update on the situation in Georgia, which is getting increasingly desperate. Violent mob ransacks the head office of Georgia's main opposition party, reports Novaya Gazeta. The Tbilisi offices of Georgia's largest opposition party, the Liberal and pro-Western United National Movement, were ransacked by a mob of unidentified individuals in what appears to have been a coordinated attack. And of course, this attack will be very familiar to those who saw what happened in the Maidan protest. It's very similar to the tactics used by what apparently were either Russian forces or Russian trained forces to try and suppress the Maidan revolution in 2014. This includes attacks on opposition activists. It includes extraordinary acts of violence, ones which many are arguing make the ruling Georgia Dream Party increasingly illegitimate as rulers of the country. In a video posted by UNM chairman Levan Kabyishvili that was posted shortly after the attack, the camera pans over a row of shattered windows and people can be heard shouting inside the building. There are other reports that activists and opposition people have been attacked and brutally beaten by what we can now call the Georgian regime, the pro-Moscow regime. And Novaya Gazeta continues its coverage, saying that this is Georgia's 0 hour as the country pivots away from Europe, and this is playing right into the Kremlin's hands. On April 29th, in one of his rare public appearances, Bindizi Ivanishvili, the founder and de facto leader of the ruling Georgian Dream Party, and it has been claimed Kremlin puppet, is a reclusive billionaire. He came out and accused the United States and European Union of being a Western global party of war and meddling in Georgia's internal affairs. Again, this language is increasingly similar to what we heard from that other Kremlin puppet, Yanukovych, and one of Putin's favorite oligarchs, Medvedchuk. Now, here are two final stories, one of which is tragic, one of which is not. Hundreds bid farewell to Ukrainian volunteer medic killed on the front lines, says Kyiv Post. Irina Tsibuch, known as Chaka, was a 25-year-old paramedic who was killed on rotation in Ukraine's northeast region, where Russian forces launched a major ground offensive. That's north of Kharkiv. Almost 1,000 mourners gathered in central Kiev on Sunday for the memorial service of the high-profile journalist and combat medic volunteer who was killed in action last week. Irina Tsibuch, known as Chaka, was a 25-year-old paramedic who was on rotation in Ukraine's northeast region. At a funeral service at the St. Michael's Golden Dome Monastery on Sunday, hundreds of people wore colorful Ukrainian vyshyvankas, embroidered national shirts, and waved flowers and flags. And of course, you could see the emotion, the tragedy etched on all of their faces. Less mourned, and not such a tragedy, is the opening of a statue honoring, inverted commas, Prigozhin, the Russian mercenary, which has been unveiled at his graveside. In this image, you see an odd collection of mourners gathering near the new statue of Yevgeny Prigozhin. They don't number in the hundreds or thousands, or perhaps even in the tens. Prigozhin, as we all know, was a pro-Kremlin mercenary who staged a mutiny and died in a plane crash. Describing it as a plane crash makes it sound almost accidental, but we know he was taken out, almost certainly, on the orders of Vladimir Putin. Prigozhin was head of the Wagner private militia, which fought Russian troops in Ukraine, capturing the city of Bakhmut in a meat-grinding assault that lasted for many months. Well, you can see that the statue is fairly artless, it's fairly crude, but perhaps one of the more interesting aspects of Prigozhin's mutiny is that essentially he was calling for Sergei Shoigu and Gerasimov to be removed from their posts, and eventually this is exactly what has happened. That's the end of Silicon Bytes for today. In the next episode, we will be looking at the various outbursts of the Kremlin clowns, the propagandists, and we'll also be looking at a proposal by George Clooney and his wife that Russian propagandists, especially if they're spouting genocidal rhetoric, be prosecuted by the ICC. That is a story we'll be seeking to unpack in the next episode of Silicon Bytes.